Hey, real quick, before we get into that episode, do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. That way you don't miss out on any marketing nuggets. Enjoy the show.
Anybody who's thinking about starting a business, there are going to be things that come up that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but let me figure out how to resolve this issue. And I get I find a lot of joy and fun in that part of it as well. Like, okay, how can I best set up my business for long-term success?
Hi, I'm Josh Owen. As the owner of a video marketing company in New Orleans, I've been on the quest to learn everything I can about marketing. Everyone has a different style, different strategy, and a different experience. Is there a wrong way to do it? A right way to do it? Let's find out together as we make marketing make sense. Welcome back, everybody, to another fantastic episode of Make Marketing Make Sense. Today I'm joined with Steve Tortorella.
Hello.
The one and only principal architect, business owner of Studio Latofiume.
Man, it sounds so cool when you say it like that.
Really? Well,
business owner,
I'll say it if you need a little voiceover for it. We'll get this cut out for you so you can say it. But today we're all about talking about architecture because I think a lot of people have, well, as a business owner in architecture, I think it's interesting. A lot of people have ideas about architecture. We don't ever use an architect until we need it. It's kind of like this, for most people, it's like this far off thing, this distant world that we don't know about. So it's awesome having you in to talk about that in specific.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, hell yeah. Well, so I guess to start with, I think it's just going to be good to just hear, what exactly what do architects do? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you hit on it a little bit right there, right? We don't really engage with or approach an architect unless we really need one, right? Like, I think folks work with doctors a lot. They go hopefully to get checked up once a year or so. So you know what a doctor does, generally what a lawyer does, how a lawyer represents you. And architects, similarly, we get licensed, we have a lot of schooling, we do there's a lot of stuff hoops that we have to jump through to call ourselves architects, right? But unless you're building a house or building a restaurant or building a retail store for your business or something, you may not interface with an architect ever. Who knows? So I think there are a lot of potentially misconceptions that some folks might have about kind of what it is, what we do, how we can ultimately help folks in construction, which is a crazy industry, and there's tons of players. So I think to your question, what do we actually do?
What do you do? Are you skirting the question? Do you not want to tell everyone?
No, I mean, look, at the core of it, we build stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I think a good way to think about it too is an architect really, like, if you've ever built an IKEA piece of furniture, right?
I've been in an IKEA.
Okay,
I looked around.
You've never built an IKEA
I was
piece
like,
of furniture?
nah, this isn't for me.
Okay, but you built like Legos or something?
Oh yeah, love Legos.
Okay.
Yeah, I know those inside and out.
Yeah, so you could think about it this way, like you putting together the Lego blocks, right? You're like the general contractor. If somebody listening or at home has ever put together an IKEA piece of furniture, and they're hammering the nails in or screwing the little things that they give you to make the pieces fit together. That's like the general contractor, right?
Right.
And what an architect does, and what an architect and the project team that the architect builds out as well does, is really makes that instruction manual for the general contractor to build something. So if you think about it, house needs an instruction manual just like an IKEA couch needs an instruction manual for how to go together. Right. So it's interesting, I was talking with the team here before the show. I think there's this in the media and whatever, we get a lot of portrayals of architects as like the sole genius person, hunched over a drafting table and having their ideas come to life or whatever. And it's interesting because really, what goes into getting a project built is a huge project team that includes the owner or the client, the general contractor, like I mentioned, the architect, and any sub-consultants we would have, the engineers, etc. So we're really there, and the way that I've set up my firm, and I think great architects, good architects seek to help build that team and work with that team to ultimately give get to the end result of a successful project, right? There are a lot of things that can go wrong in a construction project. And it's not everyone's forte, right? I think it is, there's lots of hurdles and pitfalls you can jump through, from permitting through a city to getting, how your contractors interfacing with the material they need to use. And I think, what we strive to do, at least, is to be a partner to the owner and our clients in that whole process, and particularly for folks who may not be well versed in construction, to kind of help educate them and guide them through the overall process of it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so basically what you're saying is this, you're I guess one thing that is interesting is clarifying you're the master planner, but not the master of the plan. You're kind of like you're like the guide of the plan. There's a plan that needs to exist for this building. You're not necessarily the end all be all of the plan, but you help guide the plan from a creative, strategic point of view.
Yeah. And in some ways, I mean, we are the end all be all of portions of the plan.
Gotcha.
Right? So, in other words, like, an architect is meant to guide and guard the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So, things like, fire egress, ADA accessibility, et cetera. Those are things that really the architect's responsibility lies on. But if we were to talk about, like, the mechanical ductwork and the runs that need to go, and the air handling units and sizing and things like that, that would be a mechanical engineer's job. To integrate that into the plans. And then my job as the architect would be coordinating with them to make sure that their duct runs work within the broader design and work with the electrical circuiting and the structural plan and anything else. And then ultimately, when we bring a contractor on board and we start building with them, our job is to help them interpret the plans. If there are things that happen that are slightly different on site from what we had anticipated, we tack and change and, come up with solutions of how to resolve that. I think it's interesting because, a lot of times on bigger projects, those roles are really clearly delineated. On smaller projects like your house, you may not even need an architect, but having an architect is very helpful in a situation like that. Or, a lot of the work that we do is smaller scale, like retail, restaurant work. And I think a lot of times, sometimes folks will think like, oh, I'll just hire an architect and like I'll be done. And really it's up to us to help educate and explain, hey, here's the project team and here are the different roles that each person has and how we can, again, ultimately help make a successful project and get it built and get it running and have everyone be happy.
Man, I love it when everyone's happy, That's a good time. But I mean, speaking of like getting the project, I think going on off that, for your business, especially from your experience in the past, I know you've done a lot of architecture from the corporate side of things, and now you're doing it on your own. But, for those people that don't know much about the client acquisition process with architecture, what is, I guess, like, for you, what a lot of people talk about the RFP and like talk about like what matter. That's kind of like, especially in the construction world, from your perspective, is it price? Is it value? Like, what really comes in as like the end all be all from your perspective for what makes a quality RFP for an architect?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, expertise comes in as a huge piece. I think obviously the fee is a huge piece as well. And it's interesting too, because I'd say like every client's a little different. You know what I mean? Like what they need, what their goals are, what's important to them may shift client to client. And I think one of the big pieces, at least in my mind, of the client acquisition process as it relates to RFPs is really understanding and kind of pulling out like, what do you need? What can I help you with? And how do I create my RFP in a way that's going to respond to that? And then ultimately, again, result in a successful project for everyone, right? And I think what's interesting, you mentioned I have worked on both the sort of in my past on the architectural firm side. So obviously working within an architectural firm, also worked on the in-house development side.
Yeah.
So was doing things like awarding RFPs
Yeah.
to other architects or to general contractors. And one thing that I think is interesting, you know, I mentioned the fee and the price. It's not always the lowest price that wins, right?
Right.
So in situations like that, it may be. I actually was helping a client a couple months ago through an RFP process with a couple of general contractors, and we had a few bids. We had 4 bids. We had 3 bids that were all within about 10% of each other.
Wow.
And we had 1 bid that was 50% lower than the lowest of the initial 3
so
bids.
you went with that one.
Well, you know, something, and I talked through this with my client, and my client also was like, something's off here.
Yeah.
You know, like obviously,
what do you mean? You
are
know?
they going to come
the
in?
price is right, right?
Yeah. And try and, you know, nickel and dime us on the back end.
Right.
So it is interesting from that perspective too, because I think there can be, especially in a field like ours where the value isn't really understood, there can be kind of a race to the bottom in order to get the job, which, I mean, I've been tempted to do that. I don't know if you've been tempted to do that. Or
well, you know, at some point you got to find that fine line, I think too.
Exactly. And you know, what's going to make sense for the business? What do I know as a professional is going to be able to deliver a great result to the client? And ultimately, what do I feel good about putting out there on paper? And, you know, I think one of the other things is you got to be kind of okay with if it doesn't go your way, you know, there'll be another one.
Yeah.
And you take it as a learning experience.
Well, I mean, and I think, you know, and this is something I'm curious about because a lot of people are always, especially, I mean, architecture's in that kind of teetered, almost creative, you know, it is creative, but there's, you know, it's in the world of like very business oriented mindset, service based in some senses. But, you know, but anything that's creative, the value is kind of like could be astronomical. Could be here, could be here. How, you know, what is your process of figuring out, well, where do I price myself? You know, where do I put myself in that grand scheme of things? Am I in that 10% or where, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so, you know, the way that I think about pricing, at least, again, kind of like I mentioned in the last one, is what do I know is needed based on my experience to deliver a great project, a successful project. And ultimately, starting with that is kind of a baseline, right? So the way that I think about it, I don't always do this, but, you know, sometimes it's like, okay, you know, let me cast ahead in the future and think, you know, I've got a task. How many hours will it take me to complete that task?
Right.
What is my hourly rate? Let me multiply by that. And figure out, you know, what I should be billing for this portion of the project. I think, you know, there are also extraneous factors that may come into that. So, you know, if a client's coming and is like, hey, you know, I need to have this task done ASAP. I need to, you know, we got to rush order it. Then I say, okay, you know, I've got other projects in the queue. I may need to bump my prices up a little bit for that to account for the, you know, ask of let's rush this along. So yeah, does that kind of get to...
I mean, and especially knowing, because I think one of the things I would say too is like you've seen kind of from your past as well.
Yes. Yeah.
From like seeing, you know, you had the leg up, I guess, the advantage, you know, of seeing what other, So is it like, you know, is in your, like from your experience being able to do that is great. How influential is that, knowing other, like having been on the inside, knowing what people are pricing out to other industries, and does it hurt at all, you know, because you're in one realm, does that affect like other cities that you have worked in? And, you know, as far as like, does, you know, especially because I know you've worked in multiple different cities, do you notice any difference in like reflection of price as it like shifts from city to city?
I mean, I think definitely, you know, in a service-based business, I think it's also partially about, you know, where is the service happening, and what is the cost of, what is the cost of doing business, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is my expense on a monthly basis?
Mm-hmm.
What do I need to do to break even and or have
Mm-hmm.
profit?
Yeah.
Ideally, have
Yeah.
profit.
Yeah. That's
Um,
that's a dream, you know, to
yeah,
have little
yeah.
profits at the end, you know.
And so, to your question, I mean, I think one thing that's I spent a good chunk of my career in New York
Mm.
City. Obviously, the cost of living in New York City and the
It's just a wee
cost
bit
of
different.
everything is a little different from
Yeah.
what we have
Yeah.
here in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Um, which is interesting because, I also know that when looking nationally at projects, I know that I'm competing against firms from New York City. I also know that I'm competing
Mm-hmm.
against firms from Columbus, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
or Minneapolis, or, Salt Lake City, or
Yeah.
somewhere else that is not New York City, right?
Right. Yeah.
So you do have to kind of
Mm-hmm.
react to that and adjust to that. I think, the benefit that I have being a very small operator right now is my overhead is very low.
Right.
So I am able to take that into account, and kind of knowing what folks would come to me with RFPs when doing my in-house development work. I can take that and say, okay, um, what would be a competitive price for this type of work?
Mm-hmm.
I can also look at it and say, from the other side, what is kind of like rock bottom that
Yeah.
I can't go below,
Right.
to make it make sense.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I think it's definitely it's definitely given me a good perspective,
Mm.
but at the same time, every project's a little different, every scope's a little different.
Yeah.
And what I really try to do, and I try to do for my business as well, is to tailor the proposal based on what I think or what I know that scope to be.
Yeah.
So that ultimately we can get to, again, the best price
Mm-hmm.
that will give the best result.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, and one thing I kind of am curious about, because we keep touching on it, and now I'm like, oh, I might want to ask this question. So, like, if you
Yeah.
need a second to think about it. But having some things that I think a lot of business owners want to do is a lot of them want to just jump right in, like want to jump right into their business. Like, and I know you in particular, you had all these experiences. Then you came here, you kind of toyed around with the idea. Am I going to do my own thing? Am I going to work for someone else? From your experience, do you feel like, one, I guess it's multi-part, but get you ready. You're ready for this. Are you ready? Take a sip.
I'm
You're
ready.
gonna need
I'm
it.
ready.
We're going down. So one, from your experience, what was the greatest value you had from the inside? Looking in the past with your past experience. And what did that impact your business? How did that impact your business now? And then ultimately, was that a factor in helping you make the decision to move into your own thing, saying like, hey, I do know what it takes?
Yeah. Yes and yes.
Yeah.
So
Prior
yes.
experience, does it matter?
Prior experience. Well, it's interesting too, because I think, in a field like architecture, I mentioned there's a lot of hurdles you got to jump through, right? So I had a bunch of licensing tests I had to take. I had, you've got to work under an architect for so many years.
Wow.
You got to go to school. You don't
Man,
always have to
all
go
I
to
had to do was
school,
sign up for an LLC, man.
yeah,
That's rough, buddy.
exactly. So, what you're bringing up, though, I think is something that I thought about a lot when I was deciding to
Yeah.
strike out on my own, right? Which is, I don't want to say imposter syndrome, but almost something like, okay, like, do I have enough experience to do this, right? And having both sides of the table experience, I think, was very good from a perspective of, now I feel like the way that I present myself and my business to potential clients, I'm hopeful, is coming at it from that perspective of, I understand, having worked both as an architect and as an in-house, development arm of a company, what's important to both sides, right? And can sort of tailor my messaging to what's important to my client, and how can I in my business serve you best, because I've been that client before, right? And I've known what they're dealing with, and how cycle of the year goes, and what's happening when and all that. And the second part of that was how does that? What was the second part of the question?
I was like, he's getting there. No. Well, it really is kind of what you talked about, but I guess more so what you were saying is, does that, and really more importantly, was that a factor in what you were in your decision making?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And I think that, one thing that I kind of realized, because you mentioned, like, I moved down here in 2021. And was kind of toying with the idea of, do I go out on my own? Do I try and work with some folks? What's the situation? And I kind of realized at that point, I've been in the industry for 10 years. I see other people who are doing it, who are starting their own architectural firms, who, can do it.
Yeah.
In a way that was sort of freeing for me to say, okay, like I have the tools I need and the ability and the wherewithal, I guess, to figure out the stuff that I didn't need. Because I will say, I mean, anybody who's thinking about starting a business, there are going to be things that come up that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but let me figure out how to resolve this issue. And I get I find a lot of joy and fun in that part of it as well. Like, okay, how can I best set up my business for long-term success? In addition to the architecture side, the day-to-day, let me get some drawings together and help answer some questions from a GC.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I guess because and the last thing I'll ask on that is, from your perspective, and that's another thing, take your time to think about this if you want. Having just kind of like taken this venture, what would be some other entrepreneurs out there or people that are like doing their own thing and are thinking, hey, maybe I should go out on my own? What would you recommend if you had a recommendation to them, about, because sometimes I say like, hey, I don't wish on my worst enemy to be a business owner, so it's like, but I think you had the necessary steps in some ways to get to that point. You were working in the industry. You kind of had, some experience of the ins and outs. But, what would, prepping yourself, what would you, because obviously it comes from an angle of like, if you could prep yourself better for this journey, how would you prep yourself better so that other people can prep themselves better and skip the mistakes that you might have made?
Wow. Yeah, that's a big one. I'd say, I mean, I don't know if this is the answer that you're thinking, but so I'm very much a kind of person like, let me jump in and like figure it out as I go.
Yeah. That's how that's entrepreneurial spirit.
I think that is a pretty entrepreneurial spirit. So I would almost say like, the way that I kind of rationalized it, right, was what do like I need to live on for a like month to month, and can I get to a place where I'm at least getting that?
Right.
And then from there, it's all up from there.
Yeah.
So I think if you're trying to sort of rationalize it, or someone's trying to rationalize it in their mind, my advice would be that it's probably a good place to start. And then the other thing that I'd say, there's tons of resources out there. Like public libraries have a lot of books on small business starting up. I know, entrepreneurial clubs and things in the city, or a city,
you know about those?
Or any city. I know about those. Are great places to meet other folks who are working through the same stuff. And might be having similar to, I think one thing that is fun too is, I've kept lines of communications open with a lot of my network from my past, and not all of those folks are in architecture anymore, or may have not been in architecture to begin with. But the folks who are starting businesses as well, there's almost like a through line of like, oh, how'd you set up your accounting software?
Yeah.
Or like, how are you doing hiring? Right.
Yeah.
Like those are the things that all business owners, no matter what your industry is, deal with and have to figure out and have to work through. And there's there's not like a playbook
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
kind of go to
Yeah.
and one size fits all say, this is what's going to work exactly for me. So I think that network and that sort of community building is important as well.
Man, couldn't have said it better myself. Man. Well, I think this is a great place to wrap it up. I think, really just hearing your journey and hearing you, expound on what it takes as an entrepreneur, to keep going to the next level is great. So at this point, why don't you give us a quick shout out, tell everybody, where they can find you if they're interested in, hiring your services or interested in, talking to you more about, your journey and learning from you as an entrepreneur. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me online at my website. My firm's website is slfiu.me. So a little play on
all right.
Studio Latofiume there.
Oh.
You can shoot me an email at steve@slfiu.me.
Okay.
And I'll get it. You can follow me on Instagram. I have an account there for the firm.
Cool.
My personal account is Tortor. So feel free to follow that as well.
All right. Yeah, you're getting all out there. Let them all know. Yeah, hey, you're no shy to those people online. I like it.
Not at all.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Steve. It's been a fantastic episode of Make Marketing Make Sense. See you on the next one. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. This episode of Make Marketing Make Sense is brought to you by Comfystone. If your business needs organic social media video content, video ads, or video podcasting, hit up Comfystone at comfystone.com and follow Comfystone on Instagram and TikTok. Until next time, this is Make Marketing Make Sense.